Imagine stumbling upon a field at night. The wind moves through rows of corn, and in the half-light you see the outlines of scarecrows, bodies crucified on poles, arms outstretched, heads lolling as if broken. But when lightning flashes, you realize their chests are rising and falling. These are not scarecrows, they are children. This was the Whitmore farm of 1881, an isolated estate on the outskirts of Hallowell, Maine. To outsiders, it was a respectable household. To those who lived nearby, it was a place avoided after sundown. And to the children trapped inside its gates, it was a place of ritualized torment disguised as God's will. The Whitmores were not an ordinary family. They were prosperous landowners who claimed descent from Puritan stock, but whispers suggested they carried something older, darker. In the town records, there are hints, strange medical treatments, children listed as infirm, but never buried, reports of laughter in fields where no one should be. But this is not just a story about cruelty. It is a story about corruption that bled through the church, about institutions that turned away, about the way an entire community agreed to bury its conscience. And so tonight, we uncover what really happened to the Whitmore children. By day, the Whitmores projected a portrait of order. Elias Whitmore, the patriarch, sat tall in the front pew of Hallowell's Congregational Church, a black-gloved hand resting on his family Bible. His wife, Margaret, was spoken of as pious, the type of woman who donated wool to the winter poor. Their farm supplied corn to much of the county, and their barns were said to be the most orderly in Maine. But behind this mask there were fractures. None of the Whitmore children were seen in town after 1879. Neighbors claimed they had been born sickly or crippled. No child's laughter drifted from the farmhouse. And yet, on certain nights when fog rolled in from the Kennebec River, locals swore they heard crying across the fields. What no one knew, or rather, what no one dared to admit, was that Elias Whitmore had devised a system of punishment and control that blurred the line between discipline and desecration. He believed crippled flesh could be reshaped into living parables, that deformity was God's canvas for suffering. It was here that the first rumors of living scarecrows took root. Travelers reported seeing figures nailed upright in the fields, too still to be men, too alive to be straw. Hallowell was a town built on appearances. Every family had secrets, but the Whitmores were whispered with more dread than curiosity. Shopkeepers exchanged glances when Elias walked by. Mothers pulled their children closer, and yet no one dared confront him. Why? Because Elias Whitmore funded the church renovations in 1876. He paid for the pastor's new home, covered the debts of half the town's merchants, and quietly donated to the orphanage. To challenge him was to risk ruin. But silence is never neutral. The townspeople's refusal to intervene made them complicit. They ignored the bruised faces glimpsed in wagon windows, the sound of hammering in the fields long after sundown, the unnatural stillness of the Whitmore corn. Years later, when a state investigator finally arrived, he would call it a town-wide conspiracy of neglect. But by then, the children were gone. Elias did not see his children as individuals. He saw them as lessons. He quoted from Leviticus, from Job, from the Book of Lamentations, twisting scripture into justification. The cripple is the chosen vessel. He wrote in a journal never intended to be read. The weak made into warning. The child, bound upon the stalk, becomes the crow's eternal sermon. Each child was fastened into a field as if to become part of the harvest cycle. Their bodies were strapped to poles, arms spread wide, spines contorted against wood. They were clothed in rags stuffed with straw, masks sewn over their faces. Some survived like this for weeks at a time, fed sparingly with corn mush, left to sway in the wind while their father preached over them. Others broke, mentally, physically, spiritually, but breaking was part of the ritual. Elias believed despair carved them into closer images of Christ. Margaret Whitmore is often painted in softer tones, as if she were a passive mother trapped beneath her husband's control, but the evidence suggests otherwise. In private letters discovered in 1923, Margaret described the children not as sons and daughters but as offerings. She wrote of their eyes that roll like frightened oxen, and of the sweetness of their silence when the straps hold firm. It was Margaret who sewed the hoods. Margaret who smeared ash across their faces to protect them from the devil's gaze. And it was Margaret who instructed the farm hands never to touch the scarecrows, no matter how much they whimpered in the fields. Her complicity was not born of fear, it was born of belief. She saw herself as a midwife to holy suffering, reshaping crippled children into warnings for the world. Not all who worked the Whitmore farm were blind. Several hired hands witnessed the children nailed to poles, heard their muffled cries under burlap hoods, and recoiled, but no one reported it. Some feared Elias's wrath, others feared God's judgment, believing perhaps the Whitmores knew some truth too terrible to deny. And still others simply feared poverty. To defy the Whitmores was to lose one's livelihood. One farmhand decades later confessed in a letter, "We thought them scarecrows until one moved. I dropped my tools and fled the field. I told no one. I told no one because it is easier to be a coward than a witness." Their silence was not just fear, it was a collective burial of conscience. And with every day they failed to speak, the children sank deeper into their living crucifixions. The Congregational Church of Hallowell was the only institution that could have stopped Elias, but it did not. When parishioners whispered of strange cries in the Whitmore fields, Pastor Alcott urged them to guard against idle talk. When one mother claimed she saw a child nailed upright at dusk, she was chastised for gossip. The church did not merely ignore the Whitmores, it protected them. Elias's donations were too large, his influence too strong, and the pastor himself wrote in a sermon draft, "The Whitmores remind us that suffering is the seed of righteousness." Thus, faith itself became a weapon. The crucified children were not hidden from God. They were displayed as offerings, and the church, whether knowingly or through cowardice, sanctified the display. In the summer of 1881, a peddler named Simon Griggs vanished on the road near the Whitmore property. His wagon was later found overturned, goods scattered across the ditch. Witnesses recalled seeing him turn up the Whitmore lane at dusk, never to return. The sheriff questioned Elias, who claimed Simon had passed through without stopping. But in the barn, neighbors reported a new scarecrow, its shoes suspiciously fine, its posture too stiff. When lightning storms lit the fields, some swore they saw the figure trembling. No charges were filed. The case slipped into silence, and the Whitmore's secret tightened. The scarecrows were no longer just children. Outsiders who wandered too close risked being swallowed into the same ritual. Weeks later, a body surfaced in the Kennebec River, a boy no older than 8. His arms were bent at grotesque angles, his skin pale and flaking. Around his torso were deep bruises in the shape of rope or straps. The coroner labeled it an accident. The church called it God's will. But the townspeople whispered, this was a Whitmore child. He had fallen or been thrown after breaking free from his pole. The river washed him clean of straw but not of suffering. And though the body was buried in an unmarked grave, stories spread that on foggy nights, his cries could still be heard drifting down the Kennebec. In October 1881, state investigator Harold Rainsford arrived after mounting complaints reached Augusta. He was a thin man with iron spectacles, known for exposing cruelty in orphanages, but he was unprepared for what he would find. The Whitmores welcomed him with courtesy, seated him at their oak table, offered cider and bread. They insisted their children were invalids, who could not meet strangers. Rainsford inspected the farm, but Elias guided him away from the fields. Still, he glimpsed something, a figure nailed upright in the far corn, arms bound at the elbows. When he asked, Elias claimed it was just a scarecrow. Rainsford made notes, but the next morning he vanished. His horse was found near the river, riderless. His report never reached the state. Years later, fragments of Rainsford's journal surfaced in the state archives, half-burned, water-stained. They tell a story officials tried to bury. One entry reads, children affixed to poles, masks sewn of sackcloth, straw protruding from sleeves, their eyes, alive, they moaned when the wind shifted, impossible, and yet. Another, the wife complicit, farmhands silent, pastor protective, a cult of suffering under guise of faith. These pages were marked "Do Not Circulate" by state officials. For decades, they lay hidden in restricted files labeled as fabrications of a delusional inspector. But archivists who handled them reported unease, ink smudges that looked like fingerprints, faint stains like tears. By late autumn, the Whitmore fields were lined with scarecrows, dozens of them. Some were stuffed with straw, others were not. Travelers on the road to Hallowell described the same sight, heads lolling, arms trembling against bindings, faint sounds beneath burlap masks. In the wind they groaned like a choir of broken instruments. The townsfolk pretended not to see, but the truth pressed on them like a weight. Mothers rushed their children indoors. Men avoided the farm road after dark. The scarecrows had become part of the land, like gravestones no one would acknowledge, and in this silence the Whitmores grew bolder. They no longer feared discovery. The fields had become their cathedral. The children, their congregation, the crows, their only witnesses. By winter of 1881, Hallowell was no longer merely a town with secrets. It was a town infected. People began reporting dreams, strange, synchronized dreams. Farm wives described seeing children nailed to wooden poles, their eyes black with crows. Merchants woke to the sound of straw rustling in their bedchambers. Even the pastor confessed privately that he dreamt of walking through a cornfield where every stalk was a child's arm. The dreams spread like fever. Children who had never seen the Whitmore farm began waking at night, screaming of scarecrows that breathe. It was as if the land itself carried the echoes of the Whitmore ritual, seeding terror in every household. Pastor Alcott, who once defended the Whitmores, began to unravel. His sermons grew frantic, his eyes sunken. He spoke of fields of Golgotha, and the children that God will not claim. One night he was found wandering the graveyard barefoot, muttering that the Whitmores had turned their children into angels hung between earth and sky. Days later he hanged himself in the bell tower. In his coat pocket a note was found, "They do not die, they wait." The church bells rang once, then fell silent. From that day forward no sermons were delivered in Hallowell. The congregation dispersed, leaving pews to gather dust. Faith had collapsed under the weight of horror. Those who dared cross the Whitmore property line described sensations that bordered on hallucination. The cornfields hummed as if alive. Straw shifted without wind. Shadows lingered too long between rows. One neighbor claimed he heard his own name whispered by a scarecrow. Another said he saw his late brother's face beneath a burlap mask. By then, it no longer mattered whether Elias Whitmore's ritual was real or imagined. The psychological violence radiated outward, warping perception itself. The Whitmores had made their farm into a theater of suffering, and every witness became an unwilling participant. In December, a group of townsmen finally gathered to confront the Whitmores. They carried lanterns, axes, and whiskey-fueled courage. They intended to storm the farm, to cut down the scarecrows, to free whatever children still breathed. But when they reached the fields, they faltered. The lantern light revealed dozens of figures swaying, groaning, their eyes reflecting firelight through holes in burlap. One man screamed and fled. Another fell to his knees, praying incoherently. None raised their axe. None cut a rope. The mob broke apart before it began. The Whitmore children remained bound. Cowardice had become tradition, and the scarecrows swayed on. It was not courage that ended the Whitmore reign, it was fire. On January 2nd, 1882, a blaze consumed the Whitmore farmhouse. No one knows who lit it. Some say a vengeful farmhand, others a mother who had lost her child. By dawn, the house was ash, the barns collapsed, the family unaccounted for. But the fields still held their scarecrows. Blackened by smoke, stiff with frost, they stood unburned. When neighbors returned days later, they found no bodies, no Whitmores, no children. Only rows of scarecrows swaying in the winter wind, their burlap faces untouched by flame. The fire was written off as an accident. The Whitmores, officials claimed, perished in the blaze. The scarecrows in the fields were said to be nothing more than farm dummies charred by smoke. The state filed no charges. The church issued no statement, and Hallowell, eager to shed its burden, buried the story. Within months, the Whitmore property was abandoned. The land sold for pennies to a Boston investor who never set foot upon it. But official stories are often the neatest lies. Those who saw the fields knew better. They whispered of shapes that lingered long after the fire, of shadows that bent against the wind, of burlap masks, that seemed to turn when one passed. Decades passed, the Whitmore farm decayed into ruin, swallowed by weeds and silence, but the scarecrows never left. Hunters reported them in the distance, half-rotted but upright, swaying as if nailed to invisible stakes. Children dared one another to enter the property at night and claimed the scarecrows moved when watched. In 1923, surveyors clearing land for a new road reported finding human bones bound with rusted wire beneath the soil. Among them were small skulls, teeth worn down by starvation. The records of this discovery were sealed, stamped classified, and vanished into state archives, but rumors seeped back into Hallowell that the Whitmore children had never died, that their suffering had fixed them to the land, that the scarecrows, whether of straw or bone, were waiting still. Even now, the Whitmore farm remains empty ground. No one builds there. Locals avoid the fields, especially on windy nights. Travelers who pass claim the corn rustles in patterns, like 100 mouths whispering at once. And sometimes in lightning storms, figures appear along the ridges, outstretched arms, bent heads, swaying bodies silhouetted against the sky. They vanish when the light fades, but those who see them never forget. The Whitmore story was not merely one of parental cruelty. It was about a town that chose silence, a church that chose complicity, a state that chose suppression. Together they created a wound so deep that it bled into the soil itself. The Whitmore children were not buried, they were planted, and like all things planted, they endure, rooted in silence, swaying in the wind, living scarecrows on ground no one dares to claim.